Small Town Murder Songs is a story of crime and redemption set in a small Mennonite community in rural Ontario about a local police officer with a history of violence who's trying to redeem himself within the eyes of this pacifist community. And when there's the first murder in 50 years, he tries to solve it and prove to the people that he's a changed man.
There's a girl, she's dead.
Ma'am, we can dispatch an ambulance.
No, she don't need an ambulance.
The reason that the film is almost a tragedy is that if the lead character has these impulses that he has violent impulses, he's like an aggressive man, and but through religion he tries to change all of the external circumstances of his life to change, but just because you change a religion or change, like, that doesn't actually mean you're changed, and the change has to come internally. So I think by the end of the movie, for me, the arc of the film is him being pushed to the point where he could enact violence, and it is the test as to whether he will, whether he actually is the same man he always was, or whether change is even possible in that way.
She ain't local.
First murder?
Yeah.
Sir Walter sure got his work cut out for him, eh? Only murder he's seen's on the idiot box. Don't imagine he'll be solving much.
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. The original inspiration for the character was actually an ex-girlfriend's dad, but I mean, that was only more like the physical aspect, because I liked the idea that that he was clearly like a larger man, like he had strength to him, but I wrote him very specifically as somebody who had a bit of a mask. He wore like big glasses and has a big mustache, and that just sort of hides a lot of his expression. And by the end of the film, actually his glasses end up getting broken, and it's very funny. Like, as soon as the glasses come off at that point, like, he looks very different, and you can actually see his eyes in a way that is more intimate. So for me, that there was just aspects of an ex-girlfriend's father that, from a physical perspective, that I latched onto. I mean, Mennonites are, as a religion, they're very there's a lot of them in Ontario and in Canada, and a couple of close friends of mine grew up Mennonite. Although there's like saying Christian, there's like a lot of different degrees of how conservative you are and how devoted you are to how literally you take certain scripture. But so anyway, I do have friends that grew up Mennonite very specifically, and so they were in some ways an inspiration for the film, like just in our dialogue. But for me, from the beginning, what really just inspired me to make the movie is that I wanted to make a movie based on a record, like an album, and I wanted to explore the ripple effects of murder in a small community. I wasn't aware of it, I think, when I was writing, but 2 people were shot to death on my street. So there was, and I live in like a very sort of friendly, part of Toronto. So I think there was very much a sense of like a loss of innocence of a neighborhood, and I wasn't consciously saying, I want to go and write about, this, murder within an innocent area. But I think, at least on a subconscious level, that was certainly at play.
Was it you up at Point Beach yesterday morning?
Just give me the ticket.
This Steve, he here full-time now?
That ain't none of your business, Walter. You can't come by the house no more.
You sounded pretty distressed in the 911 call.
He found a dead, naked girl by the lake. Yeah, I was distressed.
I ain't like I was.
Walter, you can't change who you are, but you can choose to act against your impulses.
She don't want to see you no more, you hear?
And you sure can't touch this case. You're done.
Walter!
Amen.
I've come to realize that my first instincts for casting, my very first ones, are often wrong, because they are reflecting of they're reflecting of the obvious. They're like, this would be the perfect guy. But then we've already seen that person play that role several times. One of my first instincts was actually Chris Cooper. But Chris Cooper's played this sort of small-town cop several times. So there was definitely elements of why I was instantly drawn to that. Partly, I think, as the writer, I could sort of imagine that actor doing things. But what I think is always much more interesting then is to take those impulses and then, cast in against type. Like, don't go for the obvious. Go for, take somebody who we wouldn't expect to see in this role. And then I think take all of the elements that I liked about those Chris Cooper performances and try and fold them into somebody who we would never expect. And in much the same way that when I eventually do get to cast Chris Cooper, I'll try and do something very different with him, because I think it's just a greater sense of surprise and mystery. It's like if you cast somebody that is always playing the bad guy as the bad guy, it's obvious. And that's the thing with Peter, actually, in my film, is that because Peter often is the bad guy, there was an interesting tension that was created because you can't help but distrust him because as a character, partly, I think partly because of the fact that you remember him from Fargo or from all these other movies where he's played the villain. So for me, but ultimately taking a character like that and putting them in the foreground, but giving them like a rich internal life, that for me is a much more interesting sort of creative arc.
I know what you've done.
Get that shiny dollar.
Walter! Walter!
I mean, if you just look at, say, the actors like Peter and Martha Plimpton, I mean, you couldn't have, in some ways, two more different actors. I mean, Martha comes from such a Broadway theater background, and just this like consummate like deep focus, whereas Peter is typically much more used to working on like big Hollywood movies, and so whereas Martha would be like deeply focused throughout the whole process, Peter would be like joking around. He'd be like singing and dancing. Like honestly, he'll be like he's very funny. Like I'm surprised he doesn't do more comedy because he's so funny. But he'll just be joking around, and then it's like, and then he'll suddenly just like be calm and go into the scene. But whereas Martha is very much just from a different school, so I'm not going to try and tell them how to be different. I just try and adapt differently to however they work to get what I need. So I mean, whether that's just a different dialogue, a different energy, a different, or talking to them separately. I mean, like that often does happen if you have like three actors with very different processes and they're all in the same scene together. It can get frustrating because I know I could tell one person something that this person will disagree with, but it doesn't. Not everybody has to agree. Like all that matters is that they do what I want at the end of the day. I mean, or at least they just do something great. Like that's really, and I'm going to be the one editing the movie. So at the end of the day, whether they like it or not, they'll be doing what I want because I can sculpt it. But just it doesn't, trying to balance those personalities, I think is fundamentally, I think diplomacy, I think, is the key to directing for me. I think, and trying to get performance. You can't be, or at least I can't be too rigid in terms of saying this is the way we have to work. What you can be rigid in is you can insist on a certain quality of work and a certain honesty, and you just have to figure out ways. Everybody's going to be different, and figure out how best to get them to be as honest with you as possible.
You think I did the right thing?
I mean, for me, Fargo was never. I mean, it isn't. I mean, the Coen brothers do definitely come up as a reference. I think certainly just by the sheer fact that I'm casting an actor who is sort of iconic in a couple of their movies, and I'm doing a rural, like a small town crime drama, like that in and of itself. But I mean, stylistically, the movies are very, very different. I mean, Fargo was very quirky and very funny, whereas this is actually a much more sort of somber and formal and restrained movie with like a bombastic musical score. So they're very, very different. But I mean, from an outward perspective, there are similarities. It's certainly not a it's certainly a compliment for anybody to compare it to the Coens. I mean, if anything, I would say No Country for Old Men was actually much more of a reference for us. Mostly in terms of like the cinematographer that they work with, Roger Deakins, his lighting style is very much something that myself and my photographer Brendan Stacy relate to and really admire. And so I mean that the style of that movie in terms of was more of a reference certainly than Fargo, but and in many ways I think it has more to do with this. That would be I think it would have more similarity than that, but yeah, I'm not going to complain. I wrote the movie around a very specific album, and that's actually not the music that's in the film. I wrote it around a friend's album that I really loved, and it just became one of those things where when I got into editing, I realized that the sort of tone and style and pace of the movie had been so influenced by this original score that when I put that same music back up against it, it was very much like casting the actor who was the obvious choice. Like for me, it would have been casting Chris Cooper in a way. And there was no conflict. Like it was just everything said the same. It was all on the same palette. Like it was all the same color. So for me to essentially cast a new musician, that would play against that, Bruce Peninsula, which is the band, sort of came into the fold, and I was introduced to their music in pre-production on the film. And I had an idea that maybe I would use one of their songs as sort of a bookend. It would like start the movie and end the movie. But as I was in post-production and figuring out the film, there was a certain point when their sound just completely took over. And what I loved was that in music for me in movies, especially in a movie as quiet as this, it's very hard to be subtle with music because as soon as you bring it in, you either have to keep the score throughout the entire film, or you become so aware of the fact when you take it out. And I feel as well in a movie as quiet as this, at least I'm become very conscious of the fact that I'm being manipulated by the director to feel something with the music, if it's sort of like subtly manipulating under the scenes. So rather than be subtle, I just felt like I'd much rather be bombastic. And what I liked was that it really helped me play the religious arc of the character without having to talk about religion. Like the characters almost never speak about religion, but with the title cards and the music, you can imbue a simple dinner scene with a state of religious gravitas because of the music that has just preceded it and that will follow. So it became, for me, it just very much became like a character in the movie and just part of the journey.
And please tell me something about your camera concept.
In terms of the visual style of the movie, it's funny. My first film was very like dirty, gritty, urban. It was very much set in Toronto with like a lot of handheld. It was shot on Super 16, and I just I intentionally as well wanted to do something different, and just off of a gut level, I wanted to do something I guess a bit more nostalgic. I guess the idea that this town in some ways had an innocence that had been preserved. Like they haven't had a murder in 50 years. That to somehow embrace a slightly older style of filmmaking, which was very much, embracing widescreen and large master shots and really taking the time to let things play out in a single frame. And what ended up being really interesting for me and has informed my work going forward is that there's actually quite an incredible amount of power to be had by holding a master shot because it creates a tension between the audience and the images on screen. Because in a wide shot, if two people are, say, in an argument, and all you say you're only seeing them in profile, you can't tell what's going on necessarily in terms of the subtlety. Like, is one guy going to stab the other guy? Like, there's a tension because, if you cut to their eyes and you see that, like, one guy's about to start crying, we've answered the question, he's guilty, or he's going to... But there's a tension fundamental. We want to know more, and the image is denying us what we want, so there's a fundamental tension. And I think a lot of mistakes that can be made, some people can blame music videos, but I mean, I like music videos for what they are, but is the idea that you're afraid to not give the audience there's a fear that you have to give the audience what they want every single second. So the minute somebody wants to see something, you feel, I gotta show them that now, as opposed to actually, for me, I consider it more like, like sex and dating. It's like you don't just whip your clothes off the minute you meet, right? There is a tension and a desire, and then by not having something, you want it more. And like that kind of relationship between an audience and a movie is actually quite exciting. And I think that's fundamentally how you build tension, because just like the sort of horror movie, like quick scare, that can be startling, but it's not lasting. It's not a lingering tension, whereas the classic Hitchcock quote of seeing a bomb blow up scares people for 1 second, but seeing a bomb under the table and then watching people eat lunch for 2 minutes, like that's 2 minutes of terrible tension because you just never know when the bomb's going to go. So that for me was that all really informed how we went about shooting the film. And there was a few scenes where I did a little extra coverage just in case, in case I was like, okay, well, in case the performers don't get the acting the way we need it, we have to cut in, I'll do a little bit of coverage just so we can tell the story. But for most, in all the scenes where it stayed, like, it plays in just one shot, my intention was always just to let it play out like that. I guess I'd say my two favorite scenes are probably when he talks with his father by the car, and just what is communicated for me, because I love that actor who plays his father. Like, there's just what's communicated just in their body language, and as well, I think when the mother identifies the girl's body, and again, it's just played out in one shot. And for me, it's just like, it just reminds me of how emotionally complicated a master shot can can be, and that there is a real power to get really deep emotion and just much more complex emotion. I felt like if I pushed in onto a close-up, it would have been emotional pornography, like to watch this woman cry. But to watch her from a distance, I mean, it really was. It was almost like as if you'd watch a stranger get hit by a car. Like, you the viewer are at a distance. Like, you're not privy to their emotion, but you can see it happening and you can empathize. But for me, it just was a much more interesting and complex relationship.
My woman, girl.
I mean, yeah, I was named by Variety magazine as one of their 10 directors to watch this past year, and I mean, obviously it feels nice. Like, it's always nice to be acknowledged, but it definitely did have a fundamental impact on my career and my work, just by the sheer virtue of the fact that I now have 5 movies being made in the States. But so I mean, for me, the way I sort of see an award like that or an acknowledgement like that is it's like a pair of stilts that help you stand up within a crowd of people. And at the end of the day, whatever you have to say or whatever you're selling has to stand for itself. And just because somebody does that, it doesn't mean you're going to be making more movies. But it is an opportunity for people to say something and have more people listen for a very short amount of time. So I tried to be very conscious of that and didn't expect, just because I'm on that, people are going to be just handing me new movies. But what it was a chance for, because I've been writing so many new films, it was a chance to ultimately sell and set up all these new movies that I wanted to make. So I actually my next movie, which I start shooting very soon, which just happened about 3 weeks ago, I got hired to do, is actually a horror movie, like a very smart horror movie, but it is still a horror movie. More like in the vein of, I can't say what it is yet because it hasn't been announced, but it's actually the sequel to a very famous horror movie, but it is more in the film. It feels more like a Polanski movie than a horror movie. Like, it's much more like a Rosemary's Baby, The Tenant, like that kind of world of a movie. So that I'm doing, and then I'm also doing a supernatural thriller set in a small town. I've got very different tastes. I mean, I'm also doing like a rock gospel musical, political thriller. So I mean, I think it's funny. I grew up very much loving like art film, as much as Star Wars, as much as Michael Haneke.